Cardiac conduction system is the topic of this screencast. You may find information on this topic in Chapter 11 of your textbook. This screencast was designed to help you achieve the following objectives: explain the function of the cardiac conduction system, describe the movement of electrical impulses through the cardiac conduction system, describe the components of an EKG, and explain how it can be used to diagnose a heart condition. Define dysrhythmia, bradycardia, and tachycardia. Describe fibrillation. In an earlier screencast, we discussed the cardiac cycle and how blood moves through the heart. Obviously, this requires coordination among the hundreds of thousands of cardiac myocytes that are found in the heart. There is a network of specialized myocardial cells called the cardiac conduction system, whose purpose is to control cardiac function, ensuring that the heart beats in a coordinated and effective manner. The atria must contract prior to the ventricles, and the ventricles must contract such that blood is moved from the apex to the base into the great vessels. Cells of the cardiac conduction system, or CCS, have autorhythmicity, meaning that they can spontaneously depolarize. They do not have to be stimulated by a motor neuron or another cell. They have positive ion channels in their plasma membrane that allow positive ions to move from the extracellular fluid into the intracellular fluid. And this causes depolarizations, and these depolarizations do reach threshold at a consistent rate, causing action potentials to be produced in these cells. The cells of the CCS, like all other cardiac myocytes, are linked to one another by gap junctions and to other myocytes by gap junctions. So when they produce action potentials, those action potentials to spread to other cells, and when other cells produce action potentials, they are stimulated to produce action potentials as well. This figure shows the anatomical components of the cardiac conduction system and the steps that are involved in one heartbeat. The black arrows show the spread of electrical impulses through the cardiac conduction system. The cells of the sinoatrial node, or SA node, fire at the highest frequency or rate. So they fire first, serving as the natural pacemaker of the heart. The SA node is located in the right atrium near the opening of the superior vena cava. After the sinoatrial node fires, a wave of contraction passes over the atria as action potentials are passed from one cardiac myocyte to another, resulting in the contraction of both atria. Recall that there is a fibrous skeletal barrier between the atria and the ventricles. So action potentials cannot simply pass from the atria into the ventricles, except through this narrow area of the cardiac conduction system called the atrioventricular, or AV node. This node does not have a lot of gap junctions and is very narrow, so the conduction of action potentials through the AV node is slow, and it causes a delay which allows the atria to contract and empty of blood prior to the action potential being passed to the ventricles. Eventually, the action potential is conducted into the atrioventricular bundle, or bundle of His, which pierces that fibrous skeletal barrier and carries the signal into the intraventricular septum. The interventricular septum is that structure that separates the right and left ventricles. So we have the action potential being conducted by the atrioventricular bundle or bundle of His. The AV bundle, as it's called, splits into bundle branches which extend down the interventricular septum to the apex of the heart. Note that the atrioventricular bundle and the bundle branches do not stimulate contraction of cells in the ventricles because they're not connected by gap junctions to neighboring contractile cells. At the apex of the ventricles, the bundle branches divide into smaller Purkinje fibers, which then turn upward and carry the electrical impulses to the ventricular contractile cells. And as a result, the ventricles contract, but there's specifically a wave of contraction that spreads upward from the ventricular apex toward the great vessels, squeezing blood from the ventricles like a tube of toothpaste, delivering it into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. This figure from another book also shows the cardiac conduction system, but a much cleaner version and more appropriate for the following discussion. So I mentioned that all of the cells of the cardiac conduction system spontaneously depolarize and produce action potentials, but they produce action potentials at different frequencies. The sinoatrial node, the natural pacemaker of the heart, depolarizes about 100 times per minute. The atrioventricular node, or AV node, depolarizes about 50 times per minute, and the AV bundle of His depolarizes about 30 times per minute. So in healthy people, the SA node always sets the pace or acts as the pacemaker of the cell because it depolarizes much more quickly than the AV node or the AV bundles. Therefore, all other parts of the cardiac conduction system are stimulated to generate action potentials in response to action potentials generated by the sinoatrial node. Now you may say, hang on a minute, the sinoatrial node generates action potentials at 100 times per minute, but that is not the normal resting heart rate. And you would be correct. The normal resting heart rate is somewhere around 70 beats per minute, and this is because the autonomic nervous system influences the rate of depolarization of the SA node. In a resting individual, the autonomic nervous system decreases the activity of the SA node. It can also increase the rate of depolarizations of the SA node, say during fight or flight or during exercise. If you recall, voltage is a measure of charge between 2 points. The resting membrane potential had a voltage across the plasma membrane of negative 70 millivolts. There were more negatively charged ions relative to positive ions inside the cell compared to outside the cell. Changes in voltage occur when depolarization occurs and also when repolarization occurs as ions move from the intracellular fluid to the extracellular fluid or from the extracellular fluid to the intracellular fluid. Well, we can measure these changes in voltage and generate a map that illustrates these changes, and this map is called an electrocardiogram or EKG or ECG. It literally measures the electrical activity across the plasma membrane of, in this case, the heart. The components of an electrocardiogram are as follows. The P wave represents depolarization of the atria. The QRS complex represents depolarization of the ventricles. And the T wave represents repolarization of the ventricles. Hey, isn't there something missing here? I'll give you a second to think about it. Did you miss the repolarization of the atria? Why is there no wave showing that? Well, repolarization of the atria would occur at the same time that depolarization of the ventricles occurs. And so the repolarization of the atria is obscured by the QRS complex. So an electrocardiogram is an electric record of a heartbeat. The figure below from your book shows the image of electrical changes in the heart over 2 heartbeats. And by observing an electrocardiogram, we can learn a lot about an individual's heart, determine the health of a heart, and diagnose a heart condition if one is present. For example, an enlarged P wave could indicate an enlarged atrium. An enlarged T wave might indicate an enlarged left ventricle. If there was an abnormally long PQ segment, that is the time from P wave to R wave, it might indicate that there was some blockage of nerve impulses between the SA node and the AV node. By looking at this EKG and looking at the time from P wave to P wave, we can determine a cardiac cycle for an individual and their heart rate. So we can learn a lot about an individual's heart just based on the electrocardiogram. So a normal rhythm of heart contraction, as established by the heart's natural pacemaker, the sinoatrial node, is called a normal sinus rhythm. An abnormal rhythm is called a dysrhythmia or an arrhythmia. I discourage use of the term arrhythmia because A means no, and the term literally means no rhythm. And it's inaccurate. There is a rhythm, it's just abnormal. So I discourage use of arrhythmia and encourage the use of dysrhythmia, which is more appropriate. Normal resting heart rate is considered around 72 beats per minute. If heart rate falls below 50 beats per minute, an individual is said to have bradycardia. This could be caused by damage to the cardiac conduction system, or you could simply have an individual that is very much in shape and therefore they have just a very low resting heart rate. So it really depends on the individual. If heart rate increases above 160 beats per minute, the individual is said to be tachycardiac or have tachycardia. This could be caused by excitement, stress, or a chronic condition such as hyperthyroidism. Another type of dysrhythmia is fibrillation. Fibrillation is a total loss of coordination between cardiac myocytes, where they're no longer beating in unison, but in a very uncoordinated fashion. If this occurs in the atria, you have atrial fibrillation. While this is not an immediate emergency situation, it does decrease the efficiency of the heart, and it can cause some long-term problems, so the individual does need to seek medical attention, but it is not an emergency situation. Ventricular fibrillation, or VFib, requires immediate medical attention because the ventricles are the actual pumps of the heart that create the pressure gradient to move blood through the blood vessels. And if there's a loss of coordination, there is basically total loss of the ability to distribute blood from the heart through the blood vessels. This figure shows a normal EKG at the top and fibrillation at the bottom. The only means to treat ventricular fibrillation is with a defibrillator. A defibrillator delivers a shock to the heart that allows the SA node to take over and reestablish a normal sinus rhythm. It's like pushing a reset button on the heart. if you will. An automatic external defibrillator is typically used, and it's maybe used in combination with CPR. You can find these located on the walls on the various Madison College campuses. They have greatly improved the success of CPR. If you have an individual who is prone to ventricular fibrillation, perhaps they have a chronic disease that has weakened their heart, or they've had previous heart attacks, they now have internal defibrillators that can be installed, and when they detect ventricular fibrillation, automatically deliver a charge to defibrillate the heart. Now let's review the objectives of this screencast. Explain the function of the cardiac conduction system. Describe the movement of electrical impulses through the cardiac conduction system. Describe the components of an EKG and explain how an EKG can be used to diagnose a heart condition. Define dysrhythmia, bradycardia, and tachycardia. Describe fibrillation. The cardiac cycle will be the topic of the next screencast.